Grow your practice, grow your wealth, grow your impact. Find out how to spend less time in the dental chair and more time on the things you love.
Welcome back to the Dental Wealth Podcast. With me, as always, is
Eric
Moore.
I didn't know if I was supposed to jump in on there or
Instead of adjectives, I went with inflection points in the voice.
They say that's the hallmark of a professional, right? They know when a vocal variety and pauses and inflections. And I was listening to this is a completely random thought, but I was listening to Eminem. That was from Georgia. I was listening to Eminem.
You've been spending too much time in the South.
I was listening to Eminem, and he was saying that that nothing rhymes with orange, so he
changed
the syllables to orange, right? Because then he can rhyme things with it. So it's like we got to hit the inflection point so we can rhyme.
Slant rhymes. It's like what? What are we talking like?
Someone's listening to this podcast. They're like, what podcast I just listened to?
Every time somebody gets on, they're like, the first 5 minutes are the best 5 minutes.
This is the 90s rapper, the 90s
right podcast. It's either sports or rap now. That's what we're going with.
The Super Bowl is kind of interesting. It was like everyone that was in their 40s was like, yeah, and then everyone in their 20s are like, these guys are old.
It was like a trending topic on TikTok and stuff. It was like all the kids showing their parents and stuff tuned into the TV, loving it. It was hilarious.
It's crazy. Yeah.
We just had a great event. We had a lot of doctors attend one of our mastermind groups. I know you were out in Arizona visiting with a client. We had our advisors running some mastermind groups, and one of the big topics of conversation that came up, and it's kind of what I want to dive into in this podcast, is they were just asking some general questions about inflation. We all know inflation's high, and I wanted to get your thoughts on it. Is there anything that's pointing out to you, that's standing out to you, or that practices can do to help with this time crisis?
Kind
of a loaded question, but there's a lot of different angles you can tackle on this.
Where do you want to go with this? Should we just talk about Elon Musk now, or is that where we should go with this?
I think Elon, and then I think Bezos just came out with a thing just saying they're kind of misdirecting the information so you don't pay attention to the inflation crisis right now. So it's a mess, and I feel like people are like, what do I do?
Well, it's a crazy time because that we have these different constraints and factors, which is the government kept pumping out money it didn't have and writing checks, and you see this in countries like Venezuela who started pumping out checks and ended up having inflation in the tens of thousands, right, percentage wise. And so here is the United States government, and Biden kept just cutting checks, and and let's cut more checks and more checks and more checks and more checks. Well, at some point that's got to come to roost, right? And there are some other factors obviously that go into inflation, but we start to look at it from a day-to-day standpoint. What's also affecting the PPP funds, as well as EIDL and everything, also affected the labor market. And you and I were talking about this because I said, look, I mean, if let's just say that you're John Smith, DMD, and you're trying to get a hygienist, and you got, $112,000 in PPP funds, which is, it's a good check. But your DSO across the street got $28 million, and so it's like one of these things where it's like there's challenges in the labor market, and on top of that, there was the thing about business is it writes itself. That's the good thing about capitalism, and there's some challenges with capitalism, but that's the good thing about capitalism, is that it kind of writes itself. And what I mean by that is, so one of the things I was preaching before COVID hit was you got to have capital, you got to have access to capital, access to capital. Well, we would have seen when COVID hit, the companies that did not have access to capital would have went under or struggled, and then ultimately speaking, it would have cleaned up the market, and and ultimately the Darwinian principle, the survival of the fittest, right? But
bringing out the analogy.
But it's true. It's really true. And so what happened was all these businesses were propped up that ultimately, fair or unfair, were propped up by these checks. And then I remember 2-3 years ago, the hygiene schools were were laughing at the dental schools because they're like, you're pumping out too many dentists. Well, we see who was right and who was wrong, right? There's an adequate number of dentists, but not an adequate number of hygienists.
So labor markets with gas prices, I think it's interesting to me to see kind of, how this is all playing out in the marketplace, because so many people are, affected by the labor shortage and then these inflation prices. So I feel like there's a lot of noise, and a lot of times they turn to you specifically to ground them, to get them refocused in on the business. We always call, block out the noise, guard your cup, focus in on your business, and then ultimately it'll take care of yourself in the long run.
First of all, we were talking about the labor market 2 years ago. It's like, okay, now we've kind of hit a place, but understand that we're probably going to move into a recession, which, by the way, is not a bad thing. We really need that. I mean, and so don't look at it like it's a bad thing. And so what will happen is, over time, we got to bring the labor market down. We got to get the cost of goods down. We've got to basically right inflation. I'm not sure we have the right administration to do that, but I'm not going to get into politics. But we do know that right now that there are labor shortages and there are unique strategies. But let me tell you a few things. One, irregardless if inflation's 8.5%, the rate of return in a dental practice, if done well, blows by. Like, all you got to do is do any kind of a IRR type number and look at the rate of return versus your cost of capital. So there is still a cost of capital. I know people don't do these calculations, and it's funny because I sat down with a group of doctors one day, and I go, "Hey, let's break out Excel." And they were like, "A what?" And I was like, "Excel, Microsoft Excel." And they were literally, I had people like open like iPads and they were trying to download the app. I'm like, "You don't know how to use Excel?" And so it's kind of interesting. Maybe I'm an MBA, so maybe I'm a nerd when it comes to Excel, but I think you should be able to use Excel, by the way. I mean, it's basic input. So anyhow, my whole point is that teaching them to do basic internal rates of return and look at what the internal rates of return are, because if we look at the internal rates of return and we're smart about that, what ends up happening is that the internal rates of return blow by significantly the cost of inflation. Now, the challenge is hey, but Eric, what about the cost of I don't like this word, but I'm going to use it in this context because it actually applies in this context. What about the cost of human capital? So that is the only time when you can use that. Don't refer to your team; they're your team. They're not, but this is for looking at more from a capital standpoint. So when we look at it from a capital standpoint, we say, okay, well, there's a cost of that. That's why business schools use that term, is because the fact that there's a cost of the humans that you employ. So we start to say, okay, well, if that's the case, we understand that the cost of those individuals right now, the labor market, is more expensive than it usually is. So here's not your strategy. Don't do this strategy. Just bitch about it. Okay?
Yeah.
And sorry if you're offended by that word. I told you on the podcast, I'm a prior sailor, so it happens every now and then. But hear me out. Don't sit around with your friends and talk about how expensive people are. Stop it. Like, it doesn't help you. Quit sitting in that circle. Like, yes, hygienists want a lot of money these days. It's called supply and demand. It's economics 101. Here's your problem. You go back and ask 5 of your friends who are failing and struggling what they would pay a hygienist. Stop talking to your friends. They don't know what they're doing. If they would, they'd have more hygienists they know what to do with. I've told you on this podcast what to do before, by the way. Yeah. But that's a longer term thing. Right now, in the short term, you might have to use some unique strategies. You might have to pay more to hire individuals, but understand that you can make that up if you're smart about it. You've got enough margin to make it up if you're smart about it. Now, it might cut into your current margin that you currently have, but go back and look at it from an abundance mindset and say, how do I raise? So for instance, let me give you an example of what I mean. So you start to say, okay, well, this hygiene, it's costing me $10 more per hour to have a hygienist. It costs me $20 more per hour to have hygienists on my team, whatever it ends up being, okay? You have to go back to your business and say, how do I make $20 more per hour? And it's not that hard to do. Like, it's not that hard to do. But if you sit there in a circle with people who aren't doing creating strategies and you just complain about it, that's not a strategy. So
Yeah.
so you got to go back to say, okay, look, if it's going to cost me $20 more for this team member, okay, or $10 more or $15 more, here's what you don't want to do. Not hire that person for $4 an hour. That's just stupid. I'm sorry, it's stupid. That's a business term, stupid. So we do want to go and say, look, what do I have to do from a revenue standpoint? And you might look, you have, here we are at 8.5% inflation, but you haven't increased your fees in 2 years. Like, stop. Increase your fee. Like, it's time. And you got to pass on some of the costs of your supplies onto the consumer. That's the way this works. That's how all companies are doing it. It's happening to us. It's happening to everybody. We're having to do it. You have to do it. It's the way that this is why it's called inflation.
And they're going to see that. So if you're worried that, if I increase my fees, my patients are gonna leave me. Everyone knows everything is going up right now. And if you don't adjust to the marketplace, you're not going to be able to survive. It's always about adjusting the marketplace. And I would make the point, an argument here is, last week you were in Arizona, you were working with a very successful doctor, and helping them build out, and modifying what we've mentioned on this podcast before is your flywheel. I think a lot of times if you're listening to this podcast and you are struggling with inflation and struggling with team members and all of this, it's probably because you haven't perfected your flywheel. Because if you had your business flywheel, that makes you recession proof. That makes you accustomed to anything that gets thrown in your way. As long as you're following your flywheel, you're going to be successful. And I wanted to make that point because I know you've been spending a lot of time with a lot of high-end clients in trying to help them create this model so that they don't have to worry about things like this.
Well, and look, in 2011, I remember in 2011, there was a big problem. And here was the problem. The problem was they were saying people were coming out of college with master's degrees that were having to work at Starbucks. Do you guys remember?
Yep.
Do you remember that? Everyone was like, college degrees aren't worth anything nowadays. You can't even get paid for your master's degree. What's the point? This was the big talk of the day, was that nobody was hiring, and you were sitting there with this degree and nobody would pay you for it, and all this was
it all started with you needed to get your master's degree in order to get to this point, and everybody went out and got master's degrees, and then nothing happened for it.
So then all of a sudden it's right. They in 2009 they were like, I'm gonna get my advanced degree since I lost my job, and so in 2011 they still weren't hiring. Now we're at a place where the labor market's the other side, where it's if I was telling somebody, I was like, if I didn't own Tower Leadership, look, everyone's hiring, but the problem is that it still has its own challenges, because here's what the problem with getting paid more than your value is, because there will be a lot of people, including hygienists, who are getting paid more than their value. And the problem with that is when the market rights itself, and it will, they will find themselves unemployed. Yep. The problem is they will fix their expenses based on their current income. And so what will happen is they'll be used to making $100,000 as a hygienist, and then they'll go down to $52,000 as a hygienist, and they'll go, oh my gosh, what just happened? Yeah. Well, you got paid your value versus what the market was demanding for a short-term period of time. So there is something about that, and knowing that if you go to the marketplace and you extort the marketplace, then ultimately the marketplace short-term will pay you what you want to get paid, because the famous Jim Rohn would say, you can't get rich by demand, right? And so,
Do you see that being a problem in the future? Inflation is high. Like we're talking about, the labor market is crazy right now. So a lot of times people, from what I've seen in the industry, people are expecting a higher salary than basically what they can produce from a value standpoint. And a lot of times the companies are giving it to them because they need the help. Do you see that becoming an issue, just like with, say hygienists or a COO or someone coming on that in a year or two?
So it's interesting. I cut you off. Sorry. I didn't do that. So
you had something pop up in your head. I got
it. Brilliance. I got to get it out on the table. All right. So look, here's the deal. So when we go back and we look at this and we say, okay, what's the deal? What's happening to the labor market. What's happening? Okay, this is where emotion rules the day, unfortunately, instead of economics. Okay. The labor market goes up, the labor market goes down. Supply and demand. The thing about capitalism is capitalism has a great way of actually correcting itself. It's one of the beauties of the economic system, is that it rights itself. And it does go into pendulums, of course it does, but it tends to right itself. So what you're going to find is over time, now we can argue about, government control over that and government manipulating markets, and that's a conversation for a different podcast. If we want to really get into wealth of nations and some economic theory, but I think that it's more important to understand is that you are in a short-term period. I saw Kiyosaki the other day wrote Rich Dad Poor Dad, and Kiyosaki, dump the stock market, it's all going to crash. And I thought it was so funny because it's like, isn't that interesting that we literally freaking okay, what's happening to Bitcoin? What's happening to Ethereum? What's happening to housing prices? First of all, I said on this podcast like a month ago, hey, housing prices are going to drop because ultimately speaking, as inflation goes up, there's going to be less people who can afford that payment. So then there's going to be more supply. This is Econ 101. And then also it was like a week later and I saw, it was like Idaho. They showed like hundreds of homes just sitting there empty. So look, this is what happens. And so the same thing happens with the labor market. So when someone says the stock market's crashing, this is why people don't make money in the stock market, because they sell low and buy high. They love to buy it when it's great. So when Bitcoin hits $60,000, people are like, I'm buying Bitcoin. Yeah. But when it gets down to 21,000, people are like, I'm not buying it. It's sinking. Yeah. I'm like, okay, hold on. You don't understand that. So what Kiyosaki is telling everybody is, hey, sell off all your stocks and go buy gold. Okay. Well, okay. I remember I cannot make this up. It was 2015. I want to say 2015. I sat in front of a doctor. The doctor sold off her entire portfolio to buy gold. And was like, and literally was like, oh my God, everything's going to hell in a handbasket and I'm going to buy gold. Do you know how much money that cost her? The amount of money she lost by selling off in 2015 because of emotion, because she was watching Fox News and getting the crap scared out of her. So she decides that ultimately speaking, she's going to sell it all off. Look, that is a complete irrational move. I see it all the time. This is what people do. They sell low and buy high because it's emotion. The stock market goes down. What did you think was going to happen in the stock market? It's at an all-time high. What did you think was going to happen? Do you think the stock market's never going to come down? That is ridiculous. Yeah. Of course it's going to come down. The real estate market will never come down. I had a lady tell me one time, the Toronto real estate market will never decline. I'm like, that is just an asinine comment. Like,
who was the guy that said that the dollar bill will never recover?
They're related to me, so I'm not going to say. But I remember saying that because he is a mathematician. I was like, that is the most ridiculous statement. He is a mathematician. So I was like, look, that doesn't make any sense. Of course it will come back. We make movements on these. So the same thing is like, instead of being rational and saying, look, the labor market's high, but I'm losing money because I don't have somebody in the chair right now. I need to be able to pay this person temporarily with the labor market ultimately is sitting at. If in the long term, this person doesn't provide the value to me ultimately with the marketplace, because this is what ends up happening. If you want to go to an employer and say, well, I want top dollar, don't be surprised that you get laid off as soon as things change. Because why would I pay somebody $80 and $80,000 when I should be paying them $50 if the market corrects itself and I can go get a talented person for $50? I'm like, why am I paying this person $80,000? Yeah. And so that's what ends up happening when labor markets correct themselves. So, and it will correct itself. Make no doubt. You heard it here first on the podcast, Did It Well podcast. Yes, of course it's going to correct itself. Real estate market will correct itself. Look, yes. It will correct itself. In 2007, I remember when I was for those of you who don't know, I was living in Sarasota, Florida. We were going to move into, something ranch. I'm trying to remember what it's named. Some of you in the Tampa area know what I'm talking about, but it's off, Fruitville Road in Sarasota, Florida. Sarasota, Florida is a great time, but this was 2005. The real estate market was through the roof. And we were going to move to Sarasota, Florida. My wife and I were going to move to Sarasota, Florida. And then what ended up happening was the real estate market, I remember there was a big joke in Sarasota that more people had their real estate license than they had their driver's license. And agents wouldn't talk to you unless you were buying $1 million home. And it was kind of just this crazy thing. And so what happened is that the house that we liked, we were going to buy was $220,000. Now, I think we were probably, 23 or 4 or whatever. We were looking at this house, and literally within a year, that house was like $580,000. But it even got worse. There was a house, we went into an open house, and there was 1,300 square foot home, no upgrades, no backyard, Formica countertops, and it was like $576,000 with like 72 people on the waiting list. And I was like, and we moved to Georgia, where I was like, you can buy what? Yeah. And so
sounds kind of familiar right now.
So then of course those houses, that was all speculative, and the houses dropped, and then what ended up happening is those houses that people bought at 576, we know what happened. I mean, the rest is history. And so, we don't make, like, I could look at a house at that time, at that price, and go, this is overvalued. By the way, it happens in dental practices too. Some people pay overvalue. DSOs are doing this right now. They're overvaluing dental practices. But people ask me, is there a bubble in the dental market? I said, of course there is. And so, these are, and that can be saved for another podcast, but I will say there is a dental market bubble. Of course there is. And there are, inflation is happening. We need to get control of our emotions, and we need to say, look, the internal rates of return are strong. We have a strong internal rates of return. That's a fact. In our business, we need to be able to look at abundance mindset, not scarcity. Don't look about what you don't have, but look what you do have. And then utilize your assets to go after these people. It's costing you, some of you, it's costing hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to not have a hygienist. And yet you're like, well, I'm not paying $10 more an hour. I'm like, you're losing a lot more because you don't have the talent, because you keep asking your friends.
And if you don't know how much it costs you, not to cut you off, but a lot of times I see this, even like when people call in too, and they're like, I'm having problems with this person. Well, you need to figure out, if you're sitting there saying, I can't pay them $10 an hour, you're not looking at the numbers. You need to know that this person is going to be able to produce this much in your dental practice. And if I pay her X, this is what it looks like, and this is the profit margin on it. If you don't know those numbers or how to calculate those numbers, you're going to fail fundamentally as a business owner. And we see it all the time. You're so focused in on what an hourly rate is rather than, all right, this person's going to be able to produce X. And in the dental world, it's pretty simple to know how much this person in your practice is going to produce. Like, there's enough statistics. It's not like it's a sales position or something else in a company. It's tried and true. You know what they're going to produce. You should know the numbers behind it. So if you plug and play this person, I know the revenues will increase this much.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to. So what we're getting at is, like, don't let, like, I open up, every morning I do this. Now, not every morning. Sometimes if there's an overriding story, I try not to do it. But Fox News, I go to Fox News, and then I go to CNN, because I like to hear both voices. And then I go to Twitter and see what the town hall's saying, which is always a joke, which makes you emotional and angry. But I'll go to that because I'd love to see the different perspectives, right? And how they're trying to manipulate your thought process. Look, CNN is trying to manipulate your thought process. Fox News is trying to manipulate your thought process, okay? It's just the way it is. That's where they are today. You can complain about it and say, well, what if Walter Cronkite? Well, okay, sorry, those days are over. There's no unbiased media anymore. It's all just basically to manipulate your thought process. It's all kind of propaganda. Look, some of you are like, oh no, Fox News is different. No, it's not. All you gotta do is go to Fox News and then CNN. You'll see this. You'll see they're pushing an agenda. So I'll go and listen to both sides, but understand both sides are trying to scare the world out of you. Right now, what's end up happening, if you go to Fox News, like I went there to Fox News this morning, and the narrative is ultimately is anti-Disney. It's anti-Biden. It's the inflation's out of control, that everything's falling apart because the Biden administration doesn't know what they're doing. And look, that's fine. That's the narrative, okay? Then the other side, CNN is all on Ukraine. There's not a thing about it. Like, I went to the main page of CNN this morning, and I swear there was not a thing about inflation. There was not a thing about the economy. It was all about Ukraine, and it was about, all this other stuff. And I was like, they're literally trying to get you not to think about inflation and how bad it's out of control. So you're being manipulated when we hear this. But the problem is, like, for instance, if you just go into Fox News all day long, like, you're scaring the world out of yourself. Yeah. And then you go to somebody else and they scare the world out of you. And then you keep getting this vicious cycle. But that's not active. That's not a strategy. A strategy is like figuring out what you can do about it. So we have to have an active strategy.
Yes. The news is going to get worse, by the way, too, because the midterms are coming up. So if you think they're scaring you now, just be prepared. One of the things that you and I try to do is prepare the listeners for what's to come, what is happening now, and give them strategic advice on it. Guess what? It's coming. This summer is going to be, if you turn on the news, it's going to frighten you. You're going to be scared. You're going to be thinking, how am I going to do this practice? How am I going to start this business? How am I going to pay my employees? Like, that's going to happen because midterms are coming up. One of the best way to get people elected is to scare people with the current policies. So just be prepared for that.
Yeah, because they go low before they go high. And I watched, I watched analog TV the other day. I know it's like terrestrial, whatever.
Is that like a PBS?
Well, it was like CBS or something like that. But I turned it on the evening, because I only watch, I keep my cable for sports, and that's it. Yeah. And so other than that, I don't know that I'd watch anything on, cable. Uh-huh. So I turned on cable the other night, and every commercial is I didn't see this, but it's everything's an ad, and I don't watch YouTube videos or whatever. I don't get in. I don't see all this, but it was I was ad after ad after ad. This candidate did this, and this candidate did that, and it's wow, okay. So how much of this is really? How much of it can you control? Yeah. How much of it is that you can't control? See, people get wealthy in low economic times and they get wealthy in high economic times. How do you take advantage of this marketplace? What can you do in this marketplace to take advantage of the market? What can you do ultimately to set yourself up? Because you can't control the things you can't control. You can't control what Elon Musk is going to do with Twitter. You can't control the stock market. You can't control who's going to win the midterms. You can go vote, and that's about it. If you want to get on Twitter and you want to spew off some hatred, that's fine. You can do it, but it's not going to get you anywhere. Okay. So what we do is we look at our dental practice and we go, look, what are the rates of return of things I can invest in the dental practice? What can I get as a rate of return? Because if you actually do some math around it, you'll realize your rates are pretty good. Also, look, businesses don't get 30% profit margins. They get 12% profit, 10%. Banks get 1 or 2%. Yeah. So look, you got margin in there. Quit. How about, there was a TikTok video you sent me yesterday. Yes. I should play the beginning on this podcast. Should I do that? You play it? It was basically the professions who ultimately, it was a financial person. And she was I'll tell you the professions that are ultimately broke are dentists and doctors. Why? Because they think they have to have some standard of living because they're a doctor, and so they spend everything they make. Well, the problem is that now all of a sudden that 30% margin becomes zero margin because they've spent everything they make. How about living inside your means? And if you live inside your means, then you have margin. And if you have margin, then you should have accumulation. If you have accumulation, you have the ability to weather the storm. If you don't have any money in this economic time right now, stop buying stuff. Yeah. And that's a strategy. Stop buying stuff because right now, this is not the time to be buying stuff anyhow. And so it's a good time for you to accumulate cash and wait for the economy to decrease, and it will, and things will go on sale. Mark my words. Yep. The economy is going down. I promise you it's going to happen. And so look, be ready for that. By the way, some of these DSOs are going to fail. Yeah. Fact. And there are going to be dental practices in the marketplace that are available for you to buy at a discount. But you got to have cash to be able to do that. You have to have the operational team that can do that. You have to be able to walk into an office and make things happen. You have to do that. And if you do that, you're going to be way ahead of everybody else. If you don't do that, then ultimately speaking, you're going to be hanging out with your dental friends, cursing the market. Inflation is not something you get to control. You can only do so much, but you can activate a strategy within your business. And activating that strategy allows you to have control over labor. It has you control over patient care. It has control over rates of return, because you have to control it the best you can. Don't worry about your competitors. Don't worry about everyone else. Worry about your business. Focus on it. Inflation's going to come down. It's going to come down. But we knew inflation was going to happen. By the way, this is like 5 years ago, people were predicting inflation's coming. Like, this is not guys, this has been building for a long time. So look, is the current administration the right administration to handle it? Probably not. But I'm not going to get political here. You can argue. There's a few people listening right now who are like, yeah, they are. Go Biden or whatever. I don't care. Like, this is not about politics. This is not the political podcast. Either way, we would have to argue that this administration has done a poor job of managing the economy. And so, and yes, there's people that will argue, well, it was going to happen anyhow. He just happened to be in the White House and all this other stuff. Well, he kept pumping out checks and pumping out checks and pumping out checks and pumping out checks. And most of that was pushed by the labor unions anyhow. But we know that we as a business can manage inflation. We can manage our own walls. My biggest advice on this podcast is stop talking to all your dental friends. Unless they say to you, I've got more hygienists than I know what to do with. I have more team members than I know what to do with. Then I want you to ask, what are you doing that I'm not? Yeah. Because that's the answer you're looking for. If your friend tells you, I'm broke, I have no hygienist, I can't find anybody, do not ask that person what they're paying hygienists. That's the worst person. It's like going and talking to the Detroit Lions on how to manage a football team. I mean, like, don't do it. Like I mean, you're going to get some bad advice. I mean, we'll leave the Barry Sanders thing alone, but I mean, we'll see. We got to throw sports in there at some point.
We have to. We have to
throw like a sports analogy. So,
I think it works though. I mean, you have to have a strategy for this type of things. You see, just like in the sports analogy, people just throw dollars at players that don't fit into the team just because their perceived value is this amount, ultimately to be a bust. It's the same situation with that. It's going to happen. Like, inflation's here. You can ultimately deal with it, but you need to have a strategy behind it. If you're sitting there, and I love your point, don't talk to your friends. If your friends can't say, oh, I have so many hygienists, here's a name, this is someone that I really wanted to hire, I just don't have the capacity for it. If they can't give you that person, you're probably talking to the wrong person.
Totally talking to the wrong person, right? So it's like, talk to the right people, and then look, make investments in your business. Like And look, this is a great time too. Like, make investments in your business, let it grow. Yeah, your margins shouldn't be affected if you know how to actually price and understand what your average revenue per patient is. But even if it was, look, there should be enough margin for you to weather a short storm and get through it and be fine. And so, it's like I'm seeing some unique strategies. I'll just say that in the marketplace. Don't think about what everyone else is doing. Zig when they zag. What can you do that they're not doing? And so, I think it's just something to consider, and it's something to consider for the long haul. And it's look, don't get emotional in the markets. People lose money because of fears and fees. In the stock market, people lose money because fears and fees. They pay so much in fees they don't even recognize. And the other side is these fears. Like, look, I mean, what should happen is you should buy the stock that went from $54 to $3 when it's at $3. But instead, people buy it $55, and it's like, why did you not buy it at $3? Because you were worried about losing your money. Don't get so emotional about it. You've got to look at this thing and realize This is normal. Inflation goes up, inflation goes down. Labor market goes up, labor market goes down. In 2011, you could have hired all the hygienists you wanted for next to nothing, okay? And now you can't. So look, you have to weather this storm. You have to weather all markets, and this is a market you have to weather. But don't sit in a circle just complaining about it. Go back and talk to people who are activating strategies. And then if if you don't have a company like Tower to lean into, like find a company to lean into then, or call us up, because you got to have you have to know your numbers. By the way, you better know your numbers this time more than ever.
Yeah. And I think you said it best with just weather all markets. You said that a plethora of times on this podcast. And I think it's probably the most important thing to do. Weather all markets.
Well, Vern Harnish wrote a book called Scaling Up. And in Scaling Up, he talks about that companies should have 6 to 8 times the industry average, 6 to 8 times the industry average access to capital. 6 to 8 times the average. Why? So that you can weather all markets. So that when you have to pay for a hygienist, you have the money to do it. The PPP funds. I cannot tell you how many doctors I say, what happened to the $212,000 you got? I don't know. It's like, what do you mean you don't know? Like, it was $212,000. Yeah. So you have to have capital. You have to have access to capital so that you can weather these kinds of storms. And I think it's important to be able to do. And now's a good time to weather. Put your bootstraps on. I don't even know where that term came from. Put your bootstraps on and get ready. And look, let's put together a strategy, weather it, and look, the labor market's going to come down. And I promise you, everybody that was like, I remember 2 years ago, Matthew, do you remember this? Like we had a young lady right out of school interview with us. Mm-hmm. And she wanted $58,000. She had a bachelor's degree, no experience, right out of school. And she was like, I want $58,000. We were like, what? And now that person's probably getting paid $75,000, right? But trust me, that person will become unemployed very quickly. As soon as the market changes, they're going to look at their team and go, who are we overpaying? Yep. So it's also a very important thing as an employee to then make sure you're not overpricing your value, because then all of a sudden you're job hunting, because ultimately speaking, markets write themselves too. So I think this is a great look. Isn't business interesting? This is a great time to be a business owner. We have to navigate these markets, but by navigating these markets, we learn, we become better, we become more agile. We learn from our mistakes and we right the ship, and this is a great time to right the ship and do it.
Because this will happen again.
Of course, by the way. Now, you might sell your practice before it does, but I still think that you have to look at this and say, okay, well, let's just say that labor market goes down. What are you doing to prepare for that? Yeah. And so what are you doing, ultimately speaking, when valuations go down and valuation of your dental practice goes down or whatever? It's funny because these DSOs have been trying to scare people for a while. Now's the highest valuation ever, right? And it's like, whatever, shut up.
It all comes full circle.
But it does come full circle. I think ultimately you build a great business. You manage all markets. You have access. Fundamentals. Access to capital. Right? Manage your margins, know your numbers, right? All these things that like actually take care of people. Like these are all like the things that we, I don't know, business 101. It's, access to capital is probably the most important thing. And if you don't know your numbers, watch Shark Tank one time when all of a sudden they go, what's your acquisition cost? I don't know. What's your average revenue per customer? I don't know. What do you have in sales so far? I don't know. What's your income? Like, what have you taken home? I don't know. Well, thank you for coming on the Shark Tank. We wish you the absolute best, but we do not want to partner with you. Right? So I think it's the same thing. It's know your numbers, create a strategy, get active, guys. It's a great time, actually. You just got to know how to take advantage of it.
I like it. I think those are all this is probably one of my favorite podcasts, just because it's so important to know this information in the marketplace right now, because it's happening. So we have to do something about it. So as always, Mr. Morin, pleasure to have you in the studio. It was a joy to have this conversation. As always, like, subscribe, share with a friend. Eric's going to be traveling the country this year. So go on our website, ask around, pay attention to our social media, and Eric might be coming to a town soon to you. So be prepared for that. Thank you guys.
They're putting me on a plane. I'm already platinum, and it's like
I'm shipping Eric off to see the masses, everybody.
All right, guys, you have a good one.